The Handkerchief by Great 78. Chapter 21. The High Inquisitor. Draco's suspicions about his father's hand controlling parts of the ministry, and by extension the school, were confirmed almost immediately, as evidenced by the presence of one Madame Dolores Jane Umbridge. His jaw clenched the moment he spotted that prissy black bow atop the pile of tight curls that had been charmed brown. He had met Madame Umbridge several times in his life. She was a known social climber, the type of witch who would lick someone's boots clean one day and hex them in the back the next if she thought it would help her. Because of her ministry position, she was invited to the various social galas and banquets over the years, but as far as Draco knew, had never been invited to tea by any of the ladies in Narcissa's social circle. Now, she was looking down imperiously from her perch on the raised dais of the staff table, trying to catch the gaze of the children of the most prominent witches and wizards, and offer a little smile, as if to convey to them how much she belonged with and was beloved by them. She stared at Draco from the moment he rounded the corner into the great hall, staring long after he had looked away, uncomfortably.
"Oi, Malfoy, looks like you got an admirer," said Thaddeus, quietly, poking Theo and Blaise in the ribs and laughing, then glancing sidelong at the staff table. "She's trying to fuck you with her eyes." "Merlin's bollocks, Thad. Why'd you put that image in all our heads?" mumbled Theo, slightly shoving Thaddeus in the back.
Draco was silent. This woman might not be thinking lewd thoughts about him, but he had no doubt she'd want to cozy up to him this year. She'd always made it a point to corner Lucius and other powerful and rich wizards at every event Draco had been to over the years. She would try to monopolize their time and attention with the most mundane of conversations for as long as possible until she could be foisted upon another unsuspecting victim. Draco would laugh about it in the corner of whatever event they were attending with Theo, Blaise, Millie, Pansy, or Tracy, each trying to one-up the other with imitations of the wide-faced witch. Tracy had been able to imitate the voice almost perfectly, but it was Theo's uncanny copying of her mannerisms that had the group howling with laughter. Each night after one of these functions, Narcissa would flew home, magic crackling with annoyance. She tried to suggest that she host a New Year's Gala this year, as if the Malfoys haven't hosted one nearly every year for almost 3 centuries. After another event, Narcissa snapped, "How dare she insinuate that the House of Black seat on the Wizards' Council be dissolved? I realize it's more of a figurehead organization since the Wizengamot was founded, but the Wizengamot still accepts our recommendations from time to time, and as the only adult member of the family who is currently available to serve, I will represent the noble House of Black. Who is she to say that just because there is currently no Lord Black, that we should not be allowed a voice?" It typically took 2 or 3 cups of warm tea, laced with more than a splash of cherry bourbon, to calm Narcissa down after one of these tirades. More than once, Lucius had ended the evening musing over a double fire whiskey, idly plotting ways to pigeonhole Umbridge away. It was very much like his father to get Fudge to place a stodgy witch like Umbridge at the school. It accomplished multiple beneficial things at once for him. Lucius now had devoted eyes and ears on not just Draco, but Professor Dumbledore. He'd be able to adjust school policies to fit more in line with his own way of thinking. And he didn't have to socialize with a social leech who stole his time and upset his wife. For at least the 100th time in his life, Draco found himself both angry and begrudgingly impressed with his father. The first school day of the term began normally enough. Potter was miserable at potions, as usual, Professor Binns was an awful teacher, as usual. Professor Trelawney could barely see out of her thick, smudged spectacles, much less see the future, and Hermione had already memorized the lesson in ancient runes. Then, at the end of classes, whilst Draco was waiting for Theo and Blaise to go down to dinner with him, he heard the first whispers of gossip. Potter had been smarting off in defense against the dark arts. He'd discussed what happened last June in the graveyard, riling up Umbridge. There had been mention of Cedric Diggory. Great. Leave it to Potter to come up with a way to have everything he said repeated directly back to the Ministry, who would in turn relay it directly to Lucius and his people. Draco huffed in disgust, catching Hermione's eyes at dinner. She had to get him under control. Now that school had resumed and she'd started speaking to him again, Draco hoped their notes would pick back up where they left off. He thought it worth the effort to try and get Potter to relax around Umbridge. Otherwise, this year would go from mildly uncomfortable to miserable really quickly. As he sat at the table, he took out his handkerchief, pretending to wipe his mouth with it. He whispered, "Vinca Major," and quickly sent off a message. "You need to get Potter to stand down against Umbridge about you-know-who. She's in Fudge's pocket." He looked over to see her reaching in her cuff for her own handkerchief, dabbing at the corners of her mouth and then spreading it discreetly in her lap. A moment later, her short answer came back. "I know. I'm trying." Try harder, Hermione, he thought. Draco did not know a lot about Umbridge, but he knew a lot about what happened when you challenge someone in authority. It usually did not end well for anyone. That night, Narcissa surprised him with a flu call in his dormitory. Draco had not expected to hear from his parents for at least a week, but from the tired and worried look on Narcissa's face, it was clear that she had not had an easy couple of days without him. Draco wondered if she had left her suite since his departure. They talked about his class schedule. Draco had met with potions, astronomy, history of magic, divination, and ancient runes today. He dutifully reported that each class had gone well. Tomorrow he had charms, transfigurations, care of magical creatures, herbology, defense against the dark arts, and arithmancy. Just saying the schedule out loud made Draco feel ill. It was going to be an arduous school year. At the mention of care of magical creatures, Lucius butted into the conversation. "Ah, yes. Hopefully that will be a better subject for you this year. I am fairly certain that the oaf will not be back to teach this year." "Oh?" Draco asked, his gut plummeting. He knew from the widened pupils of Lucius that it would not take much prodding to get him to continue talking. His father had already worked his way through more than one fire whiskey tonight, by the looks of it. "Yes. Apparently he has either been killed or gravely injured down in Andorra, in the Pyrenees Mountains. He was sent there to meet with some giants. I believe Dumbledore thought having them on his side might be beneficial against the Dark Lord, but it did not go well for him, clearly. There was some kind of fight and he was caught up in it. Some of my associates were in the area and they reported finding blood in the caves in which he was said to have been hiding. He's gone already, of course, but probably did not get far if he was injured. Serves him right if he's dead. I still cannot believe that he was allowed back after that nonsense with the Chamber of Secrets, much less the incident with the hippogriff. I still think he helped it escape. Hippogriffs are not that intelligent. There's not one chance that it got itself free and escaped on its own." Draco was still. Surely his father was only speculating about Hagrid. He was smarter than that, getting himself killed, right? And he had magic. Draco knew his wand still worked, despite what had happened years ago. Giants didn't have magic, right? he still felt sick to his stomach. He had of course heard the tirade about the supposedly moronic hippogriff numerous times over the previous school year. He wasn't sure exactly what had happened with the beast, but one thing was certain. If the hippogriff was still alive, Draco was glad. No creature deserved to die because Draco had been an ass. He begged off a further conversation, rightly claiming that he had a lot of revision to begin. Draco did not mention to Lucius and Narcissa the bit about Potter bringing up Voldemort and Diggory.
He was certain that Lucius would learn it eventually, and he preferred not to be part of that discussion.
But his mind was too distracted by everything else that had been said and done today to begin schoolwork. The next morning, Draco walked down with the others to care of magical creatures. The topic of conversation, of course, was Potter's lunacy. Draco laughed, along with the others, Pansy and Goyle leading the charge. After the first question asked by the substitute professor, when he saw Hermione raising her hand eagerly, he mocked her motions. She waited until everyone's attention was back on the substitute professor, before she casually flipped him her middle finger with a smirk. Draco released a breath and felt his chest relax. Perhaps this year would not be much different than the others. If she was willing to joke back and forth like before, maybe things would be okay between them. The class began to work with the bowtruckles, and Draco overheard Potter asking Professor Grubbly Plank as to the whereabouts of Hagrid. Did their side not know where he had gone? This seemed odd, but perhaps Hagrid had struck out on his own in going to Andorra, and hadn't told anyone before he left. Grubbly Plank cut him off quickly, redirecting Potter's attention to his class assignment. Looking up, Draco caught Hermione's copper eyes. She was focused on the lesson, but also looked worried, her face reflecting what he felt inside. Draco knew Hermione considered Hagrid to be her friend. Was their side unaware that Hagrid might be injured or killed? Perhaps if they knew, they might send a search party. Maybe the stupid great oaf's gotten himself badly injured, he ventured quietly to Potter. Maybe you will, if you don't shut up, replied Potter. Maybe he's been messing with stuff that's too big for him, if you get my drift. That had to be enough for them to get going on with, he hoped. Draco felt like he'd already said too much. He moved away from Potter's group and began to work on his own bowtruckle. If the Prat couldn't get the hint, Draco wasn't going to spell it out for him. Professor Umbridge was making a name for herself in much the same way she had at ministry events and social galas for years. That is to say, like a Cornish pixie in an apothecary. The amount of silent vitriol this woman garnered from every student, and even some of her fellow staff, was remarkable, thought Draco. She seemed universally hated by nearly everyone, and it wasn't even October yet. As part of her campaign to win over exactly no one, she had appointed herself High Inquisitor of the school, a title that Draco was certain she'd made up to sound official. This meant that she'd taken to showing up in random classrooms to inspect teachers, and to confirm that they taught ministry-approved materials using ministry-approved methods. It also provided some hilarious moments. Professor McGonagall's razor-sharp wit was something to behold. Professor Snape was incredibly dismissive. Professor Trelawney was a head case, as always. Professors Sinestra and Vector knew the material so well, and Umbridge knew so little, that by the end of those inspected classes, Umbridge looked as wound up as a broken children's toy. But it was Hagrid's class where Draco could see the smarmy bent interact most with Potter. It was here that Draco realized just how much Umbridge seemed to detest Potter. As they walked down to care of magical creatures, Draco saw the jaunty black bow bobbing ahead of him, and he drew back. Vince and Greg dropped back as well.
"If she asks you about the class, don't say anything. Let me do all the talking."
He had a strong feeling that his father had already expressed his multitudinous issues with this class to the Ministry and Umbridge. He did not need Vince or Greg or Pansy piling on, talking about being bitten by flobberworms or nearly having their watch stolen by a niffler. She likely already knew about the hippogriff. He was fairly certain that if Umbridge knew the specifics about the blast-injured Scroots' behaviour and their origin story, she would disband the class entirely. Draco knew most people would find it hard to believe that he was protecting Hagrid, of all people. But truth be told, Hagrid was an all-right bloke, once you got past the gruff exterior. Draco had developed a begrudging acquaintanceship with the man over the years. It had begun back in Year 1 with Hagrid's dragon. After he spied the tiny dragon through the window, Draco had to sneak down a few more times to try and see it again. Hagrid had been suspicious of him at first, but eventually he'd softened his stance. Petting a dragon, even a small one, was a surreal experience for Draco. 2 Septembers later, Hagrid carried Draco gently up to the hospital wing with his injured arm cradled against his chest. Hagrid had leaned low and whispered gently,
"Not quite like your Starclaw, was he? Got to treat creatures the same way you treat people, Draco. Like they're all different and special, unique from each other. It's gonna be okay, son. Mickey didn't mean to hurt you, just like you didn't mean to insult him."
Through his pain, Draco bit out, "This one just had a hard time understanding me." When Lucius came after Hagrid over Buckbeak, in 3rd year, Draco kept his distance from the enormous man, except in class. The year before, after Hagrid had returned from Azkaban, he'd been able to go down to the hut and apologize in person. When Buckbeak was nearing his end, Draco felt too sick and too cowardly to do more than send a note of apology with his owl. In Draco's 4th year, he and Hagrid had to stop speaking outside of class. Draco knew Hagrid occasionally overheard his and the other Slytherins' insults. He persisted with them, even as they tied his stomach into knots. It was easier to go along with the insults of his housemates, to even add some of his own, than to go back to Hagrid's hut and apologize again. But now, when his erstwhile companion, friend, really, Draco finally admitted to himself, was lost, possibly killed by giants, Draco wasn't sure how to feel. Yes, plenty had come out over the years about Hagrid's parentage, and Draco knew that they were now on opposite sides in this war. But it didn't stop his worry, both for Hagrid and his job security in a position that Draco knew he cared about more than anything. And now this uptight ministry bitch was trying to get information about how the class had been run under Hagrid. She turned to Greg and asked, "Now, I hear there have been injuries in this class." Greg smiled as though he was about to respond, expounding upon the stupid line he'd spouted the year before to Rita Skeeter about flubberworm bites. Draco cut in, "That was me. I was slashed by a hippogriff." He said it quickly, as though it were a small, barely worthwhile thing to mention, yet Umbridge made a huge show of writing copious notes, as though he'd waxed on and on about the incident. Draco gritted his teeth. "A hippogriff?" Professor Umbridge asked, as though she'd never heard of such a beast. Potter, who likely couldn't keep his mouth shut if he were being held under water, chimed in, only because he was too stupid to listen to what Hagrid told him to do. Draco glared at him. He was right, but that didn't make this situation any better. "Another night's detention, I think," said Umbridge quietly to Scarface.
Hermione and the weasel both looked slightly ill when Umbridge spoke. Potter's mouth thinned to the point where he didn't appear to have lips any more. He nervously scratched the back of his hand and snatched up his bowtruckle diagram angrily. After dinner, Draco found Hermione in the remotest part of the library, simultaneously finishing an astronomy chart and correcting her charms essay. "Interesting creatures class today, I thought," he ventured. "It certainly wasn't helped when you brought up the incident with Buckbeak," she bit out. "Umbridge already knew about that. She's known my father for years, and I'm certain she knew people on the committee that voted for that. She was just making a big deal of it for show." Hermione sighed. "I suppose you're right, but it doesn't make it any easier knowing that she's trying to oust Hagrid." "Your Merry Men too busy to study tonight?" Draco queried. "Ron is busy, and Harry has detention with that absolutely foul language, Granger," Draco said warningly, looking over his shoulder as Madame Pince crossed the aisle just behind Hermione and looked at them sharply. Hermione shuddered. "She's sick, twisted, evil." Draco was confused. "How so? I mean, I've known of her for years. She's obnoxious and an absolute parasite, but evil?" Hermione looked around for a moment, then said quietly, "Do you know what her version of detention involves?"
Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Handkerchief by Great 78.